Cedar Hollow was a forgotten pocket of the Missouri Ozarks, a settlement of fewer than 40 families trying to survive in the rugged wilderness where the law was little more than a word, and neighbors lived or died by the strength of their trust in one another. In the spring of 1834, tragedy struck when Prudence Hoffman, a widowed mother of 3 boys, lost all of her children within a matter of months. The local magistrate wrote the deaths off as accidents, but the truth buried in dusty county records tells a far darker story. By the time autumn came, 3 more townsfolk were dead, and Prudence herself stood accused of murder. The whispers in the settlement suggested her acts may have been more about vengeance and survival than simple madness. Testimonies from that year reveal a woman driven to the edge. Yet they also hint at corruption and cruelty among Cedar Hollow's most respected families. Secrets that reached higher into Missouri's power structure than anyone dared admit. Life in Cedar Hollow revolved around its modest cluster of log cabins, barns, and a central meeting house whose bell tolled for both worship and warning. Families grew what they could in small gardens, raised livestock, and traded in a fragile barter economy, with only iron ore offering a trickle of hard currency. It was here that Prudence and her husband Samuel had arrived 7 years earlier, carving out a life together until Samuel succumbed to lung fever in 1831, leaving her to raise their 3 sons alone. Thomas, at 12, carried his father's steadiness. 9-year-old Benjamin was quiet but sharp, and little Isaac, barely 6, clung to his mother with the fierce loyalty of a youngest child. Neighbors described Prudence as hardworking yet dignified, a woman whose calm presence masked depths they couldn't quite understand. When her boys died, one after another, that calm unraveled, and what followed during the blood-soaked months of 1834 became a legend whispered with both fear and pity. A tale of maternal fury, hidden corruption, and a question that lingers nearly 2 centuries later. Was Prudence Hoffman a mad woman, or the only one brave enough to confront the sins of Cedar Hollow? In Cedar Hollow, survival depended on neighbors leaning on each other through hard times, and after Samuel Hoffman's death, the widow Prudence became a figure the community both supported and scrutinized. Josiah Grimby, the owner of the largest farm, and the man whose opinion often carried more weight than the magistrate's, sent his sons to help with chores around her small homestead. His aid, however, came with an unspoken demand for gratitude and deference, the same bargain most struggling families made with the powerful ones. Meritable Stokes, known as the matron of the Hollow, kept Prudence's shelves stocked with preserves and medicine during the brutal winters. Her charity was genuine enough, but it came with sharp questions that pried into private matters, ensuring she knew everyone's business. Even Reverend Silas Corwin, respected far beyond Cedar Hollow, for his thunderous sermons, made regular visits to the Hoffman cabin. He claimed to care for Prudence's spiritual health and her son's religious upbringing, though many suspected his interest in household details had more to do with worldly affairs than heavenly ones. On the surface, Prudence embodied everything the community expected from a frontier woman. Her cabin was spotless, her garden the envy of her neighbors, and her skill in both midwifery and field medicine made her indispensable. Her boys were polite, hard-working, and a credit to her name, their good manners often remarked upon, despite the absence of a father. Yet beneath this picture of respectability, Cedar Hollow was a place where grudges lingered, where questions of land inheritance and marriage created quiet tensions that could erupt without warning. The Missouri Ozarks in 1834 were a rough balance of wilderness and civilization, and whispers of corruption, rivalry, and unspoken obligations simmered just below the surface. The region itself was unsettled, shaped by lingering fears from conflicts with displaced tribes and rattled by the growing divide between North and South over slavery and statehood. The Hoffman cabin sat at the far eastern edge of the settlement, pressed against the thick forests stretching toward Arkansas. Built from Samuel's own hand-hewn logs with a sturdy stone chimney and rare glass-paned windows, it was simple, yet dignified. Inside the main room served for cooking, mending, and living while the boys slept in a loft reached by a ladder Samuel had crafted. Behind the cabin stood a modest barn, a few cows and chickens, and a neat garden laid out in rows that showed Prudence's uncanny ability to wrest food from reluctant soil. A root cellar dug into the hillside stored the vegetables and preserves that would carry them through the long winter. From her kitchen window, she could see much of Cedar Hollow spread below the cabin circling the meeting house, the large farms that supplied grain and meat, and the winding paths that tied the community together like veins in a living body. It was once a comforting sight, a reminder of stability. But in the spring of 1834, that illusion shattered. The first tragedy came in March, just as the last frost was loosening its grip, and the hills began to show a faint blush of green. Thomas Hoffman, the eldest son, rose before dawn to check the rabbit snares he had set along the ridge above the hollow. At only 12, he already bore the responsibilities of a grown man, his steady hand and careful work habits marking him as someone his family could rely on. That morning, he walked into the trees with the quiet determination of a frontier boy, unaware that his family's descent into grief was about to begin. The day Thomas Hoffman died began like any other on the frontier, with the ground frosted over and the air sharp enough to sting the lungs. At 12 years old, Thomas rose before dawn, bundled in his wool coat and the stout boots his mother had bartered for the previous fall. He strapped his father's hunting knife to his belt, slung a sack over his shoulder, and set out for the ridge to check his snares. Prudence, busy kneading bread at the kitchen table, barely noticed the boy's quiet departure, until the stillness of the hollow shattered with the clang of the meeting house bell. Its metallic cry was the sound every settler feared a warning of fire accident or attack. Through the window, Prudence saw men rushing toward the eastern ridge, their movements swift and purposeful. She knew before anyone spoke that something terrible had happened. At the base of Miller's Bluff, they found Thomas's body broken against the limestone. He lay twisted and lifeless, his neck bent unnaturally, his skull smashed against jagged stone. Blood pooled beneath him dark against the frost, while the dawn sky reflected eerily in his sightless eyes. For years, people whispered about that image, how the boy looked as though he were staring straight through heaven. Josiah Grimby, sweating and out of breath from the run, declared it a tragic accident. The limestone trail was slick from spring thaw, he reasoned, and even seasoned hunters could lose their footing in the dark. It was the explanation the community accepted, or at least repeated aloud, because to believe otherwise was to invite a kind of fear they weren't ready to face. But there were details Grimby kept quiet. Thomas's tracks ended abruptly 20 feet from the cliff's edge, as though he had turned to confront something or someone before his fall. Nearby impressions told a darker story. Heavy hobnailed boots that didn't belong to anyone in the Hoffman household. Their depth in the soil suggested a large man strong enough to overpower a boy. Most damning of all were Thomas's injuries. His knuckles were bloodied and scraped, his forearms lined with cuts that looked like defensive wounds. He hadn't slipped. He had fought. And whatever that fight was, it ended with him tumbling from the bluff. When the men carried Thomas's body down, Meritable Stokes was already at the Hoffman cabin, skirts muddied and hair askew from running across the fields. She found Prudence standing in the doorway, pale as ash but unshaken, her eyes burning with something that unsettled even Meritable. It wasn't shock alone. It was fury, raw and controlled, as if Prudence already understood that her son's death was no accident, and that Cedar Hollow's quiet order had just been pierced by something far more dangerous. There was something in Prudence Hoffman's face that unsettled even the most seasoned settlers. Something beyond grief, as though her eyes could pierce straight through to truths the rest of Cedar Hollow either refused to see or dared not acknowledge. When she finally spoke, her voice was little more than a whisper, yet it cut sharper than any blade. "They killed my boy." The words hung in the cold air between her and Meritable Stokes, like an accusation no one wanted to hear. Meritable reached out instinctively, arms open in the gesture of comfort that women on the frontier offered one another in times of sorrow. But Prudence pulled back with a sudden animal-like motion, the reflex of someone who no longer trusted the world around her. In that instant, something shifted inside her. The carefully maintained illusion of neighborly trust and shared struggle that had sustained her since her husband's death shattered, leaving her with only the jagged edges of suspicion and rage. 3 days later, the people of Cedar Hollow gathered at the small cemetery behind the meeting house. The iron fence enclosed no more than 24 graves, each stone a testament to the cost of carving a settlement from the Ozark wilderness. Thomas was laid to rest on a rise overlooking the hollow, a place where the dead seemed to watch over the living. Reverend Silas Corwin's voice carried across the mourners, with practiced solemnity speaking of divine mysteries of promise, cut short of faith in providence. He praised Thomas's diligence, his devotion to family, his bright future, and urged the community to find comfort in God's inscrutable will. But Prudence heard none of it. His words slid past her like rain on stone. What clung to her was not comfort, but a hard, simmering resolve. She stood stiff and severe in her black dress. Benjamin and Isaac pressed close against her sides, her eyes scanning the faces of every man, woman, and child gathered there. Neighbors later remembered the way she looked at them that day, not as a grieving mother, but as someone weighing guilt and innocence. Her gaze lingered too long on certain individuals, her stare so pointed that a few looked away in discomfort as though exposed. At the time they excused it as shock, the dazed suspicion of a mother consumed by loss. Only later would they realize that Prudence had already begun her own investigation, quietly marking those she suspected, building a case not in words or petitions, but in memory and fury. In the weeks after the burial, life in Cedar Hollow appeared unchanged. Men still rose before dawn to till their fields. Livestock still needed tending. Women still carried on with their endless cycle of washing, cooking, and caring for children. On the surface, the rhythms of survival marched forward as they always had. But for Prudence, every day brought new observations. Small details she replayed and connected in the quiet hours of night. What others dismissed as ordinary, she cataloged as evidence piecing together a truth that no one else dared to face. And while the hollow went about its business, its routines unchanged. A slow and dangerous shift was taking root in the widow's heart, an awakening that would soon turn her grief into a force Cedar Hollow could not contain. On the surface, Cedar Hollow carried on with its familiar rhythms, men plowing fields, women tending households, children playing the same games their parents had once played back east. But for Prudence Hoffman, the world had shifted, and in that shift, she began to notice things that had long slipped past her unexamined. It was as though Thomas's death had sharpened her memory into a weapon, bringing to light fragments of conversations and encounters that suddenly took on new, unsettling meaning. She recalled with chilling clarity how just weeks before the tragedy, Josiah Grimby had stopped by her cabin under the guise of talking about spring planting. His questions at the time had seemed casual. How often did Thomas check his snares? Did he take the same path to the ridge each morning? Did he prefer to walk before sunrise or wait for daylight? She had thought little of it then, assuming he might be considering the boy for seasonal work. But in hindsight, those questions reeked of calculation, as though Grimby were collecting details for something far more sinister than neighborly concern. Meritable Stokes's visits, too, took on a darker cast. The matron's generosity had once seemed boundless, but Prudence now remembered how the woman's gaze lingered on her boys, studying them as if she were assessing their future. There had been questions about their health, their growth, their father's family line. Casual remarks about the difficulties of raising boys without a father. Subtle suggestions that perhaps the community should have more say in their upbringing. What Prudence had once dismissed as meddling now felt like surveillance. Even Reverend Silas Corwin's pastoral care began to unravel under her new scrutiny. His interest in her sons had always seemed genuine, his praise effusive. But she now recalled how often his inquiries circled back to Samuel's family, his preacher father, the marriages he had overseen, the records he had kept. What had once sounded like pastoral curiosity now rang like a search for secrets buried in family histories, secrets that might threaten the reputations of Cedar Hollow's founding families. The change in Prudence was gradual, like a sunrise, revealing shapes in a landscape she thought she knew. By late spring, her eyes were open to patterns she had never seen before. Grimby appeared suspiciously soon after Benjamin's illness, asking probing questions about the boy's chances of recovery. Stokes had been oddly persistent about Isaac's progress in her makeshift school. None of these encounters felt accidental anymore, but the most haunting shift came in Prudence's recollections of the morning Thomas died. At first, grief had blurred everything into a haze of sounds and fragments. But as weeks passed, memories sharpened like glass cutting through fog. She remembered voices outside the cabin before dawn, low, hurried, conspiratorial. She remembered footsteps on the ridge path, heavy and deliberate, too measured for a 12-year-old boy. And she remembered with growing certainty hearing Thomas's voice, not from the ridge where he should have been, but from much closer to home, as though he had been stopped before he ever reached his snares. Those fragments, once dismissed, now lined up like pieces of a hidden puzzle. For Prudence, the conclusion was inescapable. Thomas had not fallen by accident. He had been lured, confronted, and silenced. And the people she had trusted most may have known far more than they ever admitted. The memory of that voice haunted Prudence. It had carried a note of fear, strained and pleading, as if Thomas had been arguing with someone or begging for mercy. At first, she had dismissed it as a half-dream, a trick of her weary mind in those gray hours before dawn. But as the weeks passed and her grief sharpened into vigilance, she came to believe that what she heard was real. That her son had been confronted, threatened, and forced to walk toward the place where his killer staged his death to look like an accident. By June, Prudence's grief had hardened into something methodical. She began to watch Cedar Hollow with the precision of a hunter, her eyes sweeping the hollow from the kitchen window and during carefully chosen walks. She cataloged her neighbors' routines with an intensity few could match. She could identify men and women by their stride, their clothing, the tools they carried. And more importantly, she began to see patterns, movements that suggested planning, coordination, and intentions hidden beneath the ordinary rhythms of frontier life. Josiah Grimby became her first focus. He made repeated trips to the Eastern Ridge, where Thomas had fallen, trips that often coincided with the times Prudence's cabin stood empty, while she shopped at the small general store or joined the women's Sunday gatherings at Mehitable Stokes's cabin. Too often, Grimby appeared near her property when there was no practical reason for him to be there. Prudence tested him, altering her schedule, delaying her errands, or changing her routes. When his movements shifted in tandem, she realized with sickening certainty that her household was being watched, her children's lives measured against a plan she did not yet understand. Mehitable Stokes's behavior was no less unsettling. Under the guise of neighborly visits, she seemed fixated on Benjamin and Isaac, probing with endless questions about their routines. Where did they like to play? Did they wander far from home? Did they keep favorite spots in the woods? At first, Prudence offered polite answers. Then, deliberately, she began to mislead. Soon after, she noticed Mahitable turning up in those very spots, as if testing whether the boys would appear. Prudence realized then that the older woman wasn't making casual inquiries. She was tracking, almost hunting her children. Reverend Silas Corwin's actions disturbed Prudence most of all, precisely because they came cloaked in the respectability of his calling. His visits multiplied after Thomas's death, always draped in the pretense of pastoral care. But his questions pierced far deeper than scripture or comfort. He asked about the boy's future, about what arrangements had been made if Prudence herself were to fall ill or die. His interest in Samuel's family history grew sharper, especially in the records Samuel's father, the itinerant preacher, had once kept across the territory. To Prudence, it began to feel less like spiritual concern and more like an interrogation, as though he feared the existence of written truths that could unravel reputations and authority in Cedar Hollow. Piece by piece, the widow assembled a picture too sinister to ignore. Her family wasn't suffering from random misfortune. They were being studied, evaluated, and prepared for something deliberate. Every question, every uninvited visit, every shadow near her cabin pointed toward a chilling conclusion. Someone in Cedar Hollow wanted control over her sons or their silence, and they would stop at nothing to achieve it. The thought that Thomas's death was not an isolated tragedy, but the opening strike in a calculated war against her family, hardened Prudence Hoffman into something unrecognizable even to herself. Fury burned within her, sharper and colder than grief. But rage alone would not keep her remaining boys alive. If she was going to save Benjamin and Isaac, she needed to uncover the true reason behind the campaign against them. That meant digging into the past of Cedar Hollow, a past wrapped in respectability, yet riddled with secrets. She began her search quietly, weaving careful questions into conversations with older settlers who had been in the hollow since its first cabins were raised. Rather than confront them directly, she listened, drawing out fragments of gossip and half-forgotten tales of the early days. The picture that emerged was deeply unsettling. Cedar Hollow had been founded in the early 1820s by three families, the Grimbeys, the Stokes, and the Corwins, who quickly secured the best farmland and assumed positions of leadership. Others, like the Hoffmans, were tolerated so long as they accepted their lesser place and never threatened the hierarchy. But buried in those recollections were whispers of scandals from Kentucky, where the founders once lived. Marriages that may not have been legal. Children whose parentage was uncertain. Property taken under suspicious circumstances. Some had left debts or the shadow of criminal accusations behind. Missouri, with its wild frontiers and lack of prying eyes, had offered them a fresh start, a chance to bury the past and reinvent themselves as pillars of respectability. Yet the past was not so easily erased, especially when there were records. Samuel Hoffman's father, the itinerant preacher who once settled in Cedar Hollow, had been meticulous in keeping accounts of marriages, births, and family ties. His records were said to be more thorough than some of the founding families liked too thorough for comfort. Those documents might hold the proof of illegitimacy, stolen land, or tainted inheritance evidence powerful enough to upend the carefully cultivated order that allowed the founding families to rule uncontested. The more Prudence pieced together, the more she saw a pattern in the tragedies that had haunted Cedar Hollow. Children who drowned in familiar creeks, boys who tumbled from cliffs. They had climbed 100 times, girls who died in sudden fevers with no clear cause. Families that might one day threaten the Grimbeys, the Stokes, or the Corwins seemed cursed with mysterious misfortunes that thinned their lines before the children could reach maturity or marry into power. It was not chance. It was quiet, calculated elimination. Her own family fit the pattern too well. Samuel's death might have been natural, but the preacher's records had passed into Prudence's hands, making her and her sons dangerous in ways she had never understood until now. The realization turned fear into resolve, until the terror became real. One sweltering July morning, Prudence found Benjamin's bed empty. Panic seized her, only to be compounded when she discovered 6-year-old Isaac trembling in the root cellar, his small body curled against the cool earthen wall. He could not explain clearly, but in broken whispers he spoke of bad men outside the cabin in the night. Voices low and urgent, carrying the same conspiratorial tones Prudence herself had once overheard in the pre-dawn hours before Thomas's death. Isaac had hidden in the cellar until daylight, too frightened to move. In that moment, Prudence understood that the hunt had come to her door, and that waiting passively meant certain death for the rest of her family. Whatever secrets the founding families feared, whatever truth lay buried in her late husband's inheritance, it had placed a target squarely on her sons. And now, there was no more time to hesitate. The frantic search for Benjamin began before dawn had fully lifted from the valley. Every man in Cedar Hollow turned out, fanning through the forests and gullies with torches and dogs, while Prudence moved among them like a woman possessed, her voice breaking as she screamed her son's name into the trees. Yet even in her desperation, she couldn't help but notice how certain men seemed to head for very particular spots, as though they knew more than they admitted about where a missing child might turn up. 3 hours later, it was Josiah Grimby who led the search party that found Benjamin at the bottom of an abandoned mine shaft, nearly 2 miles from the Hoffman cabin. The shaft was a forgotten scar from old ironworks, its entrance hidden beneath brush and fallen timber. The boy was still alive, but barely his left leg, bent unnaturally, his head split open, blood matting his hair. When he finally woke, Benjamin remembered nothing of how he had gotten there. His last clear memory was climbing into bed beside his brother Isaac, and the next was waking in darkness, broken and bleeding. This time, though, the evidence couldn't be dismissed as misfortune. His nightshirt was ripped not in a fall, but in a way that suggested he'd been dragged across the ground. His bare feet were shredded from being hauled over rocky soil without shoes. Worst of all, deep rope burns cut into his wrists, proof that he had been bound before being dumped into the shaft. It was no accident Benjamin had been kidnapped and left to die. And then there was the boot. At the bottom of the pit, alongside the injured boy, lay a hobnailed boot, nearly identical to the prints found near the cliff where Thomas had fallen. The leather was scuffed and blood-stained, the sole cracked from the impact. When confronted, Josiah Grimby claimed he had lost it weeks before while hunting. But others in the settlement swore they had seen him wearing that very pair only a day earlier. The evidence was damning, and for a brief moment even the most skeptical settlers wavered. But instead of rallying to Prudence's side, the community closed itself off. Neighbors grew silent, their eyes avoiding hers, their voices clipped and cautious. The truth was clear. Cedar Hollow had no intention of defending her. The founding families had woven such a tight web of control, through threats, through favors, through buried secrets, that the entire settlement was complicit in keeping its crimes hidden. Prudence saw it then with terrible clarity. Cedar Hollow was not a community at all, but a stage play, masking decades of violence, its harmony maintained by eliminating anyone who threatened the balance. Her children were next in line. And if no law, no preacher, and no neighbor would protect them, then she would have to do it herself. There would be no appeals for justice, no pleas for mercy. The men and women who had conspired to destroy her family had written their own verdicts long ago. All that remained was for her to deliver the sentence. Her first target would be Josiah Grimby, the man whose boot lay at the bottom of the shaft, the man whose watchful presence betrayed knowledge he should never have possessed. In the furnace of her rage, Prudence Hoffman had found her purpose, and Cedar Hollow was about to learn what it meant to turn a grieving mother into an executioner. For weeks, Prudence had tracked Josiah Grimby like a hunter stalking dangerous game. She knew when he rose, when he drank, when he sat at table, and when he walked alone to tend his cattle at dusk. Those solitary trips had become his habit, and habit was a weakness. On a sweltering night in late July, when the air hung heavy and the forest hummed with the chorus of cicadas, she crouched in the oak shadows along his path. Samuel's old rifle clenched in her hands. The weapon was primed and deadly at close range, and her dark clothing made her nearly invisible in the gloom. When Grimby appeared, his boots struck the earth with the slow confidence of a man unafraid of the dark. Prudence stepped from hiding and leveled the rifle at his chest. For a long moment they stared at each other, predator and prey bound together by months of secret war. "You killed my Thomas," she said evenly, her voice betraying no tremor despite the storm of rage inside her. "And you tried to kill Benjamin." Grimby's reaction was not shock nor even denial, but a smile, a cruel, knowing twist of the lips that confirmed every suspicion. "Thought you were cleverer than the rest," he said. "Thought you could piece it together and stop it." The casual acknowledgement of guilt seared through Prudence like fire, yet she forced herself to stay calm. There was more she needed to hear. Why she demanded the word tearing from her like a wound. Why my children? "Same reason as the others," Grimby replied with chilling indifference, as though discussing the culling of cattle. "Some bloodlines are too dangerous to let grow. Some secrets too costly to let slip into another generation." His words froze her blood, yet she held her aim steady. He went on, voice thick with disdain. "Your Samuel wasn't the saint you believed, nor his father before him. They knew things that could have torn this settlement apart, ruined good families who've worked too hard to lose everything. Couldn't let that risk live on in their brats." It struck Prudence then with terrible clarity. Thomas, Benjamin, and Isaac weren't targets for what they had done, but for what they might someday know. They carried within them the possibility of truth, and for that the founding families had marked them for elimination. Her voice dropped to a whisper that shook with fury. "What secrets?" Grimby's laugh was low and hollow, a predator's growl disguised as amusement. "You really don't know Samuel never told you about the papers? His father kept records every marriage, every birth, every death since the beginning. Too honest for his own good. Those papers could hang half the men in this hollow. Marriages that weren't legal, children born to the wrong fathers, land stolen under false names. Your husband's father wrote it all down, and now those records sit in your keeping." Prudence's mind reeled. She saw in her mind's eye the wooden box under her bed, the one that held Samuel's belongings she had never examined closely. She had assumed it contained nothing more than sermons and mementos. Now, she realized it might hold proof of crimes so damning that entire bloodlines would kill to erase them. Grimby's voice grew cruel with pride. "That box of papers is more dangerous than any weapon. It's the reason your family's been marked from the beginning. And it's the reason none of you can be allowed to live long enough to use them." The rifle's crack rolled across Cedar Hollow like thunder, shattering the stillness and heralding the storm that had been building since the morning Thomas Hoffman's body was carried from Miller's Bluff. Josiah Grimby staggered back with a hole in his chest, wide enough to drain the life out of him in seconds, collapsing into the dirt, while his blood seeped into the Missouri earth. His eyes, once so cold and calculating, dimmed as they caught the last light of the day, dull as stagnant water. Prudence stood over him, steady and unflinching. And in that moment she felt the final shred of innocence burn away. She was no longer a grieving widow. She was executioner, and her war had begun. The work of hiding what she had done demanded every ounce of her strength. She hauled Grimby's corpse to the ravine at the edge of his property and staged the scene to look like a tragic fall during his nightly rounds. The hobnailed boots, the damning evidence that had tied him to Thomas's death and Benjamin's near murder, she buried deep in the woods along with the rifle that had ended his life. By the time she returned to her cabin, dawn was bleeding into the eastern sky, and with it came a grim satisfaction. One enemy down, more to follow. The discovery of Grimby's body the next morning sent ripples of unease through Cedar Hollow. Outwardly, the settlement mourned their fallen leader. But beneath the platitudes lay something sharper: fear. They knew the balance had shifted. The unspoken rules that had allowed the founding families to rule in shadows were unraveling, and Grimby's fate was a warning. 3 days after the funeral, Mehitable Stokes appeared at Prudence's cabin, carrying bread and preserves, her lips twisted into a smile that was all performance. Once the two women were alone, her words dripped with veiled accusation. "So many accidents," she said, her tone smooth but edged with steel. "So much tragedy. Makes one wonder if they're truly accidents at all." Prudence met her gaze without flinching, letting just enough of her fury shine through. "Accidents," she replied, her voice low and steady, "have a way of finding those who earn them. Don't you think?" The air between them grew taut, heavy with meanings no one could ever repeat aloud. Their exchange was a duel without weapons, each word a thrust and parry. Until both women understood what had been settled, war had been declared. Only one of them would live to see its end. That very night, Prudence set her next plan in motion. She knew where Mehitable was most vulnerable. Beneath the Stokes cabin lay the root cellar, a vast chamber dug deep into the hillside, cool and dry. Its stone walls lined with shelves of jars that had fed the settlement through countless winters. The heavy wooden door, its iron latch worn with age, had been opened and closed so many times it had become part of Mehitable's daily ritual. To the community, the cellar was a symbol of her industry and generosity. To Prudence, it was the perfect place to stage the next accident in a string of tragedies that no one would dare question. And as the shadows thickened around Cedar Hollow, the widow who had once been pitied as a victim prepared to turn her enemies' own secrets into their graves. The cellar latch had long been Mehitable Stokes' weak point. Everyone in Cedar Hollow knew she struggled with it, cursing under her breath when it stuck and shrugging off warnings from neighbors who urged her to have it fixed before someone got hurt. It was the kind of nuisance people dismissed small, ordinary, and familiar, which made it the perfect weapon in Prudence's hands. On a starless August night, when heavy clouds smothered even the moonlight, Prudence slipped through the shadows carrying a crowbar. She moved with the silence of someone who had been studying her target for weeks, timing her approach to the moment when Mehitable and her neighbors were deep in sleep. At the cellar door, she worked with patient precision, loosening the old mounting screws just enough that the latch would hold under gentle use, but fail under strain. It was sabotage disguised as decay, an accident waiting for its cue. 3 days later, the cue came. Mehitable, preparing for the church social, carried a lantern to the cellar in the pre-dawn darkness. She pulled at the latch, and this time it gave way. She pitched forward down the steep steps, her scream slicing the night as the lantern flew from her hand. Glass shattered against stone, spilling burning oil, while her body struck the cellar floor with a crack so sharp that neighbors swore the sound haunted them for years. Her neck snapped instantly. Death claimed her in a single brutal moment. No one suspected foul play. Everyone had seen her wrestle with that stubborn latch, and her failing eyesight and age made the story of a tragic misstep easy to accept. To the settlement, it was a misfortune that could befall any household in a place where danger lurked in every tool and structure. To Prudence, it was just as quiet, calculated, and complete. But Reverend Silas Corwin was not so simple. He was the most dangerous of them all. His authority was more than local. He was tied to church elders and territorial officials who would never ignore the suspicious death of a clergyman. His voice could rally the entire community against her in an instant. Prudence knew she couldn't afford a misstep. The reckoning came one late August evening. When the summer heat began to loosen its grip and the first blush of autumn colored the oaks, Corwin arrived at the Hoffman cabin, his face a mask of piety layered over something colder, darker. His expression carried the weight of pastoral concern, but behind it flickered menace. He stood on her threshold like a man both shepherd and wolf, ready to offer comfort with one hand and deliver judgment with the other. Prudence understood at once this would be her most dangerous confrontation, the one that would determine not only her fate, but whether her surviving children had any chance of escaping the hollow alive. Reverend Silas Corwin stepped into the Hoffman cabin with the calm gravity of a minister, but Prudence saw through the mask almost at once. His posture and tone carried the polish of a man of God. Yet cracks showed hard lines around his mouth, a glint in his eyes that betrayed not compassion, but calculation. He wasn't there to offer comfort. He was there to measure her resolve. Benjamin tossed restlessly in the loft above, caught in feverish dreams, his body still mending and his spirit scarred by the nightmare of the mine shaft. Isaac clung to his mother's skirts, like a shadow, small fingers twisting the fabric as though he could anchor himself against dangers he couldn't name but instinctively felt. The child's fear was unshakable, the kind born when a world once safe had become haunted with threats too large to understand. "We need to talk," Corwin said, his voice heavy with the authority of a man used to obedience. And for nearly 2 hours they talked, or rather he revealed. What Prudence heard unraveled any remaining illusions she had about Cedar Hollow. With a cold precision that bordered on boastful, Corwin laid bare the true origins of the settlement. The Grimbys, the Stokes, the Corwins. All of them had come from Kentucky, not as simple pioneers, but as fugitives. They had fled, not hardship alone, but the weight of crimes, fraud, false marriages, land theft, and blood spilled to silence those who knew too much. They had remade themselves in Missouri, cloaking villainy and respectability, building a town on bones and stolen names. The Hollow's remoteness and the absence of law had given them sanctuary, a stage on which to play the parts of leaders, matrons, and preachers. Your husband's father, Corwin, pressed on his voice, adopting the steady rhythm of his sermons, kept records. Too many records. Names, dates, property. The kind of proof that could strip away everything we built. His gaze hardened the mask of pastoral concern, dropping entirely. When Samuel inherited those papers, he became a danger we could not ignore. The words landed like hammer blows. Prudence's breath caught in her throat as the implications settled in Samuel's death had not been nature's doing. It had been murder disguised as lung fever, the common plague of the frontier. Poison had stolen him from her, while the settlement whispered prayers over what they believed was an act of God. The revelation struck Prudence like fire to dry tinder. Rage surged through her body, so hot and immediate, she had to clench her fists against the urge to claw at the minister's throat. But she held back. He wasn't done. Corwin leaned closer, his voice low but steady, as if reciting a litany. The deaths of her children, he explained, were not accidents, but part of a larger design. Cedar Hollow's founders had pruned bloodlines like farmers cut diseased branches, ensuring no dangerous lineage survived to challenge their respectability. Families who carried inconvenient truths had suffered accidents for decades. Drownings, falls, fevers that arrived too suddenly to be natural. What happened to the Hoffmans was simply the continuation of a pattern. Her family's suffering wasn't random tragedy, it was policy written in the secret history of Cedar Hollow. And now Prudence understood the same ruthless logic that had stolen her husband and eldest son was coming for Benjamin and Isaac. The minister's calm confession was meant to frighten her into submission. Instead, it hardened her into steel. He had confirmed what she already knew. In her bones, Cedar Hollow was a settlement of murderers in respectable clothing. And she was the last barrier between her children and the grave they had already dug for them. Reverend Corwin's words cut sharper than any blade. He spoke of Thomas's death without hesitation, calling it necessary, inevitable, nothing more than pruning a branch that might one day bear dangerous fruit. Benjamin, he said, showed the same tendencies, a bright mind that would not stop digging. And Isaac, still clinging to his mother's skirts, would grow into the same threat if allowed to live. His message was as clear as it was merciless. Submit or lose everything. Prudence was to deliver her sons to the meeting house after sunset the next day, where their lives would be ended swiftly under the guise of mercy. Refuse, and she would be branded a witch and a murderess, her name blackened and her body swinging from a rope, while her children were left to the founding family's judgment. But in his arrogance, Corwin revealed more than he intended. While boasting of his control, he let slip the existence of Samuel's father's papers, the very records she had only half understood, and the fact that they were hidden beneath the altar of the meeting house itself. Those documents contained the true history of Cedar Hollow marriages that were never legal children whose fathers were not the men claimed in public property, stolen under forged names and letters that showed just how wide the web of corruption stretched. Enough evidence to strip away every mask to ruin not only the Grimbys, the Stokes, and the Corwins, but every neighbor who had profited by their silence. The moment Corwin left her cabin, Prudence began her preparations. If she was to die, then Cedar Hollow would die with her. She gathered Samuel's hunting knife, a coil of rope lamp oil, and flint and steel tools, not only for survival, but for destruction. She studied every step of her plan, rehearsed it in her mind, until it became second nature. That day was an eternity of waiting, of keeping her boys close while fighting to hide the storm gathering in her chest. Benjamin, older than his years, helped her with small chores and tried to keep Isaac distracted with stories. Though both children could feel the charge in the air like thunder waiting just beyond the hills. As the sun sank, the sky bled red across the Ozarks, and Cedar Hollow seemed painted in the colors of sacrifice. Prudence Hoffman, dressed in black, kissed her sons and walked toward the meeting house with the steady stride of a woman who had already buried fear. She knew she might not return, but she would not go quietly. She would force the Hollow to look upon its sins, to choke on the truth it had buried for a decade. The meeting house stood tall against the crimson horizon, its simple clapboard exterior and squat bell tower a false symbol of faith and unity. To the community, it was their sanctuary. To Prudence, it was a tomb built of lies. As she approached, she saw shadows flicker against the glass shapes of the people who had murdered her husband, her son, and who now meant to finish the work. With every step closer, she felt the weight of her resolve settle into place. She had accepted death. What remained was vengeance and the terrible truth that would burn through Cedar Hollow like fire. Reverend Corwin and the last of his allies came to the meeting house that night, believing they were about to wipe away the final trace of the Hoffman family and secure their grip on Cedar Hollow forever. But Prudence Hoffman had come with another purpose. She would not deliver her children into the hands of their killers. She had come to tear the veil from the settlement's false respectability and ensure that its secrets would burn as surely as its meeting house. She slipped in through the rear door, moving with the certainty of someone who had mapped every inch of the building in her mind. The main hall was still and empty, but voices carried from the chamber behind the altar, where Corwin kept his artifacts and conducted his most private councils. In the shadows, she knelt by the altar and ran her hands along its wood until she found the hidden latch. A panel slid aside, and there, just as Corwin had revealed in his arrogance, lay the records her husband's father had preserved. She pulled them into the dim light: marriage certificates, altered to hide bigamy deeds, forged to steal land, baptismal records rewritten to disguise illegitimacy, and worse, letters tying Cedar Hollow's secrets to officials far beyond its borders. Territorial judges, land agents, even church leaders who had been bribed or silenced. It was not just a local conspiracy. It was a network that had thrived by cutting away any life that threatened to expose it. The sound of footsteps shattered her focus. Corwin and two men entered the hall, their voices carrying the smug assurance of hunters approaching cornered prey. Mrs. Hoffman, Corwin called, his tone rich with authority. "I trust you've brought the boys as agreed." Prudence did not answer. Instead, she struck flint to steel, and the lamp oil she had spread across the floor leapt into flame. Fire raced along the boards, crackling, devouring, turning the house of worship into a pyre. She stood at the altar, Samuel's father's papers clutched to her chest, a figure bathed in firelight, like a prophet of vengeance. These documents, she cried over the roar of the flames, carry the truth of every family in Cedar Hollow, every fraud, every murder, every innocent blood spilled to protect your lies. Corwin and his men surged forward, but the heat and smoke drove them back. His face glowed with panic, and fury twisted in the dance of firelight. "You're destroying evidence that could hang half the territory," he bellowed. "Those papers protect the innocent as well as the guilty." Prudence's reply was steady, her voice cutting through the roar. "Then let God sort them out. My children were innocent too. That didn't stop you." The flames climbed the beams, raced up the walls, and swallowed the meeting house whole. Prudence knew she could escape, but escape meant leaving her sons to face the vengeance of men who would never stop. Instead, she stayed. She pressed the damning records to her chest and gave herself to the fire. If Cedar Hollow's secrets could not live openly, then they would not live at all. Through the night, the inferno lit the Missouri hills, a beacon visible for miles. By dawn, the meeting house was nothing but smoldering ash and blackened timbers. Corwin and his companions stumbled out alive, coughing and burned. But their sanctuary and their power was gone. The fire had not only consumed wood and paper, it had consumed the mask of respectability, leaving only guilt and ruin behind. The widow of Cedar Hollow had claimed her vengeance, and the echoes of her defiance would haunt the Ozarks for generations. Their survival from the fire marked the beginning of the end for Reverend Corwin and his allies, though it would not spare them from justice. Escaping the inferno cost them everything. Without the documents hidden beneath the altar, they no longer held the leverage needed to silence their accomplices or bind the community to their will. The web of blackmail and intimidation unraveled almost overnight. With nothing left to fear, residents who had once kept quiet began to speak. Stories long buried came spilling out, accounts of suspicious accidents, unexplained fevers, and sudden falls that had shaped Cedar Hollow since its earliest days. Within weeks, territorial authorities descended on the settlement. Their investigation confirmed what Prudence had sacrificed her life to expose a pattern of death and deceit stretching back more than a decade. Families once seen as pillars of the community were revealed to be criminals, their fortunes built on stolen property and silenced bloodlines. Some fled Missouri under cover of darkness, unwilling to face trial. Others were arrested, their names forever tarnished, their sentences ranging from imprisonment to execution. Cedar Hollow's mask of respectability crumbled into dust, and what was left was nothing but a scar on the Ozark hills. Through it all, Benjamin and Isaac endured. They were taken in by relatives outside the Hollow people, who through the investigation came to learn the truth of their father's poisoning, their brother's murder, and their mother's final stand. The boys grew into men with the knowledge that Prudence Hoffman had fought and died so they might live free. To them, she was not just their mother, but both victim and avenger, a woman who had faced down a conspiracy larger than herself and refused to yield even at the cost of her own life. The legend of Prudence Hoffman spread across the Missouri territory. Some whispered she had gone mad, her grief conjuring demons where none existed. Others called her a martyr, a woman who tore open the dark heart of Cedar Hollow and paid for it with her life. History, as it often does, left the truth tangled between myth and fact. Yet the records remain archived, testimony, property transfers that aligned too neatly with death's fragments of Samuel's father's papers that survived the fire. For those willing to dig the trail of corruption, is there as undeniable as the ashes left where the meeting house once stood. The story of Prudence Hoffman is more than a frontier ghost tale. It is a reminder that corruption can thrive wherever power hides from scrutiny, that even in the wilderness, justice can be perverted, and that sometimes the only line between justice and vengeance is the will of one determined soul. So what do you think? Was Prudence Hoffman justified in taking the law into her own hands, or did her grief twist her into becoming the very thing she fought against? Let us know in the comments, and if this story sent chills down your spine, subscribe, hit that notification bell, and share it with someone who loves uncovering the shadows of America's forgotten past. In our next video, we'll bring you another tale of buried secrets and haunted legacies from the dark corners of history.